The story begins by showing a future time when monsters from hell had spread everywhere. These monsters looked extremely strange. No human had ever imagined that such beings could come to Earth and begin wiping out humanity. Major countries and cities had turned completely barren. But the only good thing about these creatures was that they didn't come out during the day. They couldn't see well in daylight, so they only hunted at night. In this setting, we are introduced to a survivor named Paul. He was surviving there somehow and gathering resources to stay alive. What Paul is going to face next is something we'll experience along with him. In fact, we'll put ourselves in Paul's shoes and try to find a solution to the problem. At the moment, as Paul was moving forward, sirens began to go off. The growling sounds of creatures echoed all around. Even though those hell creatures couldn't come out yet, they began screeching loudly upon sensing movement. Poor Paul was the only one left alive in the city. He ran off trying to reach a safe place. But then Paul saw two children under a camera. They were very small, and obviously their parents were no longer alive. So out of humanity, Paul decided to take the children in and care for them. A truly noble act. Time gradually passed, and those two children grew up. They had developed a strong understanding of survival, thanks to Paul, who had taught them these skills since childhood. One of Paul's adopted sons was named Joseph. He had gone to the forest with Paul to search for resources. As nightfall approached, Paul started calling him back quickly. Joseph returned, but the other son, Thomas, hadn't come back yet. Paul anxiously waited for him because they never stayed outside after dark. Thomas had gone to the neighbor's farm and now came running back to his father. He was very late this time. Paul got angry and warned him, "If you're ever late again, I won't let you go out." This was a father's instinct speaking, even though those boys weren't his biological children. But after raising them with so much love over the years, a deep fatherly bond had developed. All three quickly entered the house and shut every window and door securely. They knew that as soon as night fell, the creatures would emerge from their lairs, and if they got the slightest hint of someone hiding nearby, they'd definitely try to get in. For now, the three of them sat down for dinner, moving carefully according to a well-thought-out plan. After a full day of effort, this moment of peace meant everything to them. While eating, Joseph kept teasing Thomas, saying he always went to the neighbor's farm for one reason: to meet their daughter, Rose. The truth was, Thomas loved Rose and would go to the farm just to see her. Joseph started poking fun at him, but Thomas didn't like it. Their argument escalated, and soon they were fighting. Poor Paul tried to separate them, reminding them that this wasn't the time for fighting. But Paul explained to Thomas that gathering resources was more important right now. They already had very few supplies. Still, it was clear that Thomas was angry. All he could think about was his love, Rose. And in such a dangerous world, falling in love or wasting time like this could be fatal. After Paul explained, Thomas finally got into the buggy with Joseph and headed toward the riverside. Joseph was talking, but Thomas was still visibly upset. Understanding what his brother truly wanted, Joseph changed direction and drove the buggy toward the farm, instantly making Thomas happy. Joseph was helping his brother get to the one he loved. When they reached the farm, Thomas got out while Joseph simply told him, "Be back before nightfall." Joseph then headed toward the riverside alone as planned. Now we're shown the most chill person, Thomas. He was still at the farm, and of course we knew exactly why. He had gone there for his childhood love, Rose. Thomas was spending a great time with Rose. The two of them were doing everything except actual work. And it seemed clear that Rose liked Thomas too. But amid all the laughter, a sudden wave of sadness hit them. They feared that these creatures might never go away. If things continued like this, they would always have to meet secretly. Thomas immediately noticed that the sun was about to set. He knew he had to return home quickly. After hugging Rose, he ran off toward the other side. Joseph, now very worried, drove straight back home. He told his father, Paul, that he couldn't find Thomas. Joseph explained that Thomas was upset, so he had dropped him near the farm and promised to pick him up before dark. Paul became furious, scolding Joseph for doing something like this without informing him. Now Thomas was missing, and Paul knew they had to go rescue him. Paul grabbed his dog and a few weapons, gave Joseph strict instructions to lock every window and door, and then headed into the forest alone. By now, night had fully set in. On the other hand, Joseph was back at home with all the windows and doors tightly locked. He sat right in front of the door to ensure no creature could get in. But from sheer exhaustion, he fell asleep right there. Shockingly, a creature slipped its hand through a small hole in the door to check whether Joseph was asleep. It had grown long, sharp nails. But since Joseph didn't react, the creature assumed he was unconscious and moved to open the door and come inside. Just then, Joseph suddenly stood up and pulled a rope. A cage dropped from above and trapped the creature inside. It had been Joseph's plan all along, to trap the creature and protect his home. The creature struggled desperately to escape, but the cage was extremely strong. There was no way out. Slowly, the night passed. At first light, Joseph immediately took his buggy and went out to search for his father and Thomas. Paul was seriously wounded, and Thomas was trying to carry him. Just then, Thomas's dog reached Joseph, who had just arrived with the buggy. Following the dog, he found both Paul and Thomas. Joseph and Thomas helped their father into the buggy and brought him home. But they didn't know how to treat Paul in this condition. Ultimately, they realized the whole situation had escalated because of Joseph and Thomas, especially Thomas's insistence on going to the farm. Now, with the few medical supplies they had, they began treating Paul. Meanwhile, Thomas noticed something odd. The cage was slightly shaking. When he pulled back the cover, he saw the creature was still inside. Joseph quickly shut the cover again, as the creature had started to burn under sunlight. Joseph explained how, the previous night, 2 creatures had been roaming around the house, and one might return. Paul's medical treatment had begun using all the resources they had. Thomas explained to Joseph how he had fallen into a pit and was attacked by multiple creatures, but their father came and fought them all. He even caused a major explosion, probably killing the creatures. Thomas seemed happy, but Joseph was suspicious. He said he had a feeling the creatures would return to take revenge. They seemed to have human-like qualities, like anger and calculated hunting instincts. This clearly meant that the upcoming nights would be even more terrifying and dangerous. They had to stay prepared for anything. Hearing all this, Thomas became frustrated. He thought Joseph was just being paranoid. In anger, Thomas stormed over to the cage to release the creature, just to prove Joseph wrong. But Joseph stopped him, explaining that he wanted to study the creature. He needed to know how it was built and where it had actually come from. Ignoring him, Thomas forcefully opened the cage. The creature, which had been hiding inside, immediately darted out and slipped under the bed. Since the entire room was brightly lit, it was clearly afraid. Thomas's dog charged into the room, barking loudly, and lunged at the creature. Joseph noticed something unusual. The creature initially seemed terrified, but suddenly, it turned aggressive and charged straight at Joseph. Joseph didn't want to kill it. He just tried to keep it away using a wooden stick. But Thomas had a completely different temperament. Without hesitation, he picked up an axe and struck the creature directly in the neck, killing it brutally. Joseph, however, was very upset. He wanted to conduct research on it. Now that chance was probably gone. With no other option left, Joseph collected the body parts of the dead creature and began dissecting them. He needed to understand whether these creatures were like humans or more like wild animals. But their behavior didn't match that of wild beasts at all. Sadly, Joseph's dog seemed to enjoy the situation more than he did, happily munching on the creature's flesh. Despite all the effort, Joseph found nothing conclusive. Meanwhile, their father Paul was in terrible condition and urgently needed treatment. So Thomas approached Joseph with an idea. He suggested taking Paul to Rose's family at the farm, since they had a lot of medical supplies and resources. Their father could recover peacefully there. But Joseph cautioned him, asking, "Are you sure they'll help us? We need to think this through." Thomas was confident they would, and eventually convinced Joseph. They somehow loaded their father Paul onto the buggy and headed toward the farm. However, as soon as the farm residents saw the 3 of them approaching, they quickly blocked the entrance. Rose's parents explained that they didn't have enough resources to support 3 extra people. They refused to let them in. However, Rose's father made an exception. Thomas could come in alone if he wanted. He'd be provided with resources and safety, since he had helped at the farm before. Now Thomas had two options. Either go with Rose and live a safe life, or stick with his brother and wounded father in that dangerous world. Joseph already sensed what was coming. Without another word, he turned to the buggy and prepared to take care of his father alone. When Thomas tried to reason with Joseph, Joseph yelled at him, understandably angry. After all, this situation was entirely Thomas's fault. If he hadn't insisted on going to see Rose, their father wouldn't be in this condition. The brothers broke out into a heated argument. Eventually, Thomas realized he was in the wrong, but Joseph, still furious, got in the buggy with his father and drove away. Thomas, confused and helpless, went into the farm to stay with Rose's family. He'd have good food, resources, and a safe life. What more could he want? Meanwhile, Joseph brought his injured father back to their home. The two brothers had now gone their separate ways. But the greatest danger was yet to come. When Joseph arrived at the house, he saw everything scattered and out of place. He immediately understood. The creatures had been there, seeking revenge. Just as he had warned Thomas, it was happening. Now Joseph decided that if an attack was inevitable, he had to be prepared. He rushed into the house and began gathering all the defensive tools and weapons he had. He sealed off all doors, windows, everything that could be used as an entry point. He placed his father in a safe spot so he wouldn't be harmed. But just as Joseph entered the hallway, he suddenly fell into a pit, hidden under a sheet. Looking closely, he realized that the creatures had dug this hole. It was a secret way to enter the house during the night. Joseph was shocked and terrified. These creatures had minds that could think and hunt just like humans. For now, Joseph could do nothing but pray that they survived the night. Meanwhile, Thomas was shown searching the kitchen at Rose's house. He was looking for something important. Rose entered the room and asked what he was doing. Thomas explained that he wasn't a thief. He was just looking for medicine to save his father. Even though he and his brother had gone their separate ways, Thomas could never abandon his father. Rose understood Thomas's feelings and immediately handed him the medicine. Thomas became very emotional. He hugged Rose and began to leave with the medicine. He promised that once everything was okay, he would come back. But it was possible he might never return. Unbeknownst to them, one of the villagers had overheard their conversation. As Thomas was about to leave with the medicine, the man pointed a gun at him. He accused Thomas of stealing, saying, "You took this without permission, so you'll have to pay the price." Thomas tried to explain that Rose had given him the medicine and that it wasn't for himself. It was for his injured father. But the villagers were already riled up. They saw Thomas as a criminal, so they dragged him to a hidden area and tied him up completely. It seemed like they were planning to use Thomas as bait for the creatures, to let him die. Everyone was frustrated and wanted someone to take it out on. Thomas was helpless. How could he escape from this? Suddenly, one of the villagers was pulled into the ground. It was the creatures. They had arrived now that night had fallen. Another man looked into the hole, only to be grabbed and pulled in too. Panic broke out everywhere. People were screaming and running for their lives. But poor Thomas was tied up and trapped. The chaos awakened Rose's parents. Her father grabbed a candle and went to investigate, only to be attacked by a creature. The candle fell, starting a fire. Rose's mother was attacked too, both struggling to survive. The creature's sharp claws wounded them severely. Rose was asleep in her room, frightened. Her mother tried to reach her, but by then more creatures had come up the stairs. They killed her mother first and then her father. When Rose finally stepped out, terrified, she saw bloodstains all over the place. As she went to the bathroom, she saw that the creatures had devoured her parents, completely consumed them. Panicking, Rose ran out. Back where Thomas had been tied up, the creatures had already killed everyone. Thomas was still bound, his life in serious danger. One of the creatures was right next to him. He watched helplessly as others died horrific deaths around him. Just as one of the creatures lunged at him, Rose arrived from behind and shot it with a gun. Thomas quickly grabbed the medicine and escaped with Rose. The bad news was that Rose's parents were dead, and their entire house was in flames. Thomas told Rose that they needed to return to his home to protect Joseph and their father. Meanwhile, Joseph had already been preparing. He had filled all the holes around the house to prevent the creatures from using them to enter. But Paul's condition was getting worse, and medicine was desperately needed. Just then, Joseph heard a knock at the door. He grabbed his weapon, ready to defend, but it turned out to be Thomas. Relieved, Joseph opened the door, letting Thomas and Rose in. Seeing his brother again made him happy. Rose explained that their entire village had been wiped out. Now they had to come up with a plan to fight back against the creatures. But first, they went to Paul. He was given the medicine that Thomas had brought, and he began to feel slightly better. Paul gave them one piece of advice. You must protect each other to the very end. Never give up against those creatures. So they placed Paul in a safe room, and the three of them headed out to execute their survival plan. First, they started gathering fuel and flammable gases, things that could be used to create fire. Obviously, those creatures were afraid of light. Their small plan was simple. If the creatures returned, they'd set everything ablaze and kill them using fire and light. They rigged lights and flammable traps everywhere. Now all they could do was wait for the creatures to arrive, and they did. The furniture inside the hidden pit began to shake. The real problem started when one of the creatures entered through the chimney, into the very room where Paul was sleeping. The creatures had now surrounded them from all directions. A large creature stormed into the house. Thomas tried attacking it from behind, but it didn't even flinch. It even tried to grab and kill Rose. Joseph and Thomas used every weapon they had to fight it off. Rose too grabbed a gun and started shooting at the creatures. But the number of these monsters kept increasing. At this rate, none of them would survive. Suddenly, they saw Paul step out of his room, covered in blood. He had killed the creature that entered through the chimney, but he was now in even worse condition than before. Still, Paul picked up a gun and charged toward the creatures, firing continuously as more of them advanced toward him. But he quickly realized it was useless. Their numbers were only growing. So Paul told his kids, "Go hide in the freezer. It's the only place left. I'll take care of this." Thomas, Joseph, and Rose ran and locked themselves inside the freezer. Paul had run out of bullets. The creatures were nearly upon him. So Paul lit the place on fire, triggering a massive explosion with the flammable fuel and gases they had gathered. The explosion engulfed everything, burning the creatures alive. The entire house was destroyed, and Paul was likely gone too. The blast continued for several minutes. Finally, the three stepped out of the freezer. Thomas and Joseph immediately began looking for their father, but it was obvious he was gone. Suddenly, out of the rubble, a burnt creature's hand emerged. Even now, it wasn't completely dead. Terrified, the three jumped into their buggy and drove away. We now saw a new side of these creatures. They weren't just angry, they were organized. They had intelligence and a strategy. The creatures formed a circular formation and began spinning rapidly. This increased their speed and allowed them to hunt more efficiently. Rose fired her gun repeatedly to slow them down, but the creatures got closer and closer. Then Rose threw the entire gun toward them. It was rigged to explode. Powerful blast went off. The creatures' circular formation broke apart, and most of them were burned and killed. But Joseph didn't stop the buggy. He kept driving without looking back. Only when they had gone far away and felt that the creatures were no longer following them did they finally feel a moment of peace. For the first time, the three of them looked up. They saw a clear sky full of stars. At night, no one usually looked up, trapped indoors by fear. But now they were free. In the morning, they returned to the site of their destroyed home. There was nothing left. Somehow, they managed to perform their father's funeral and silently prayed for a better life. They didn't know if the creatures would ever come back. And if they did, would they be able to survive? That was a question no one could answer. But what mattered was they were together. And that's where our story ends.